Lead Me Winter Training School Madrid 2021. Media Accessibility Training, Sign Language and Subtitling for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Organised by the Tradaval Research Group and AVLA project at Complutense University Madrid.
By way of introduction, let's say that let's make it into a sort of workshop. I would like opinions whenever a question is flawed, and please feel free to open the mic and interrupt anytime, except when there's a video playing, because we won't understand anything otherwise. As I was saying to Juanpe, I'm speaking today from this grey void that you see behind me. There's no mirage that's created virtually, so that's basically what's going to happen for the next 30 to 45 minutes. The title of the presentation has to do with recreational products. It has to do with audiovisual entertainment, definitely, but with some additional layer of interaction. And it's going to be based on a study that I did not very long ago. It was published maybe last year or a year and a half ago during the pandemic. And it was about the fundamental question of whether SDH is an option for video games, for example. We know that it is an option for film, it is an option for series, it's an option for platforms. And most of the time it's the only option, actually, because we get the SDH, even if it's not extremely enriched, but it's a version of not a pure transcript or not a pure subtitle. So my initial point would be to determine what we agree a subtitle should be, or a subtitle actually is, what conventions we use, normative, legal, or non-normative, something that's community-based perhaps, and lastly, the potential changes that might be introduced. So starting with what a subtitle is, I'm going to make a difference between a full transcript that's divided or queued, sometimes not even well divided, that might be an aspect for criticism perhaps, then something like what the main audiovisual platforms are showing, which is not really SDH because it doesn't follow the norm, it doesn't follow the DIN, it doesn't follow the UNED, it doesn't follow any sort of European-wide agreement that we have, but it approaches it in some way. And then we have a more purist view, which would be absolutely SDH, even with a sampling that's corrected, supervised by people who are actually deaf or hard of hearing, or both. So, how to produce the subtitle? Do we agree that condensation is allowed? Do we agree that condensation is necessary? Most organizations, at least the Spanish ones I know and I have had contact with, agree that if they are to be offered a subtitle, it should be absolutely exactly the same and quite accurately the same that is being produced, even with the hesitations, the doubts, the comings and goings, the self-corrections, everything should be done. From Laura Feito's presentation a couple of hours ago, I also understand that those corrections and those delays that happen in live subtitling or in the subtitling that's pre-packaged and then produced for a program that isn't really live, they actually happen. 97% of the content is quite correct. The next 2% varies, and the last 1% is really untenable still by the automatization or the machine production of it. Then there's the linguistics of the audiovisual translation. For example, in Agnieszka's presentation right before, what should we do? What's more aesthetically pleasing? What's more appropriate? What does the audience expect? Because after all, this is not really a void. This is a subtitle that is almost a habit for many, even if the means of consumption or the channel through which they consume is not really the one that we're used to. When we differentiate, for example, I read in some of the questions today, when we differentiate between the dubbing countries or the subtitling countries or the voiceover countries, I don't think the division is quite so precise anymore, because we are perhaps referring to the late 1990s or the early 2000s when the most wide-ranging studies were produced. So how do we explain with that division, dubbing, subtitling, voiceover, etc., the fact that people 15 to 35, more or less, spend their day watching TikTok with the subtitle, the transcript, or whatever the text is on screen that happens on it? Or maybe it's YouTube Shorts instead, or a different format of the screen. Because every time that we talk about speed, every time that we talk about the length of the lines or the aesthetic imprinting of the lines on the screen, we are talking about something that's rectangular and usually wide. But maybe it's not the case anymore. And maybe if we judge our own audiovisual consumption, it wouldn't be the case anymore. And finally, the transformations that happen intra and interlinguistically. Interlinguistically, today and in these examples, I'm not going to be speaking about, but that's definitely an issue that remains sort of unresolved yet, because we have several languages happening at the same time, a prioritization of which one goes first, and then the relationship between that text that appears on the screen and the viewer, or the player in this case, if it's a video game. What happens with it? Do they really want the language to be in there? Do they really want the original voices to be preserved and therefore the subtitle in a different language? It's more than force of habit, I would argue. And in relation to other media, we have cinema and television. In the case of video games, as far as I've been able to see, over the last 10 years approximately, maybe even 12 years, because I started doing this sampling in 2010. My first example comes from that year. The relationship that exists between the subtitling that is done for video gaming, if there is any, and the one that we take as a reference probably comes from the times of the early DVD. So it still preserves the 17 characters per second speed and maybe the double line of, let's say, 40 characters, including the spaces. That's rather long, so it's going to be something very dynamic, to put it more euphemistically, if you will. Then another question is the subtitle layout and the subtitle synchrony, because in the particular case of video games, we have the cinematic parts, which might be, I don't know, 9 hours of literal film encrusted in the video game itself. Then you have the action parts that are usually textual in the sense that menus overlap on top of the image and they are fixed. And then interspaces, which are tutorials, for example, the spaces where the player doesn't advance the action in any way, but still the text is there to help or to support a specific kind of action. So it's going to be also a matter of editing. It's going to be a matter of condensation. But this condensation that we speak quite frequently about doesn't really exist, apparently, at least from the many examples that I've been able to lay my hands on. About the case studies that I would like to show you and obviously criticize in a positive and negative way sometimes. I have selected a few final products, a few of the fragments that I was interested in without cherry picking, and you have a couple of screenshots attached to each of these videos that I will share at the end, and also the full article with the corpus and the study. But the important thing is I would like to derive some of the consequences of what an SDH subtitle or a subtitle for the deaf and hard of hearing really is from the practice that is already happening, because we can normalize something that exists and we consider exists in a way that would be perfectible. But at the same time, there's a force of habit that also is introduced in the norm, because the use of emojis that was suggested more than 10 years ago didn't really come to fruition. But that's not a practice that should be abandoned in some circumstances anyway. And then lastly, I will offer you a summary of the findings. Then again, if you want to interrupt at any time, please feel free. This is how we're going to proceed with the examples that I've gathered. The first one is a general description of what it's like, the video game. Then the observations that we can make, very short clips, but useful enough to understand a phenomenon or several phenomena. And lastly, error detection that we assume is in the example. The first one, the first of the case studies. This is from 2010. So the technology wasn't the same, and perhaps the habit wasn't exactly the same either. Although in the 1980s and late 1980s, most of the video games were pure text and overlapping images. Let's think about the first Final Fantasy series, if you're familiar with it. It was text and text and text and text, and then very tiny characters fighting each other with numbers appearing on screen. That's a textual adventure. This isn't. This is a graphic adventure, so it's basically point and clicking. and discovering things. Maybe a broken sword is something that rings a bell for somebody else. And the source of the cutscenes in every single case will be players who record themselves playing. So it's the full game. About this first case, some preliminaries. Judge, when you see it, the subtitle position. Also, whether it's a pop-up or a roll-up position. A pop-on would be it appears, it flashes, and it goes dark, it flashes again, it goes dark, the usual subtitle that we see on platforms. Or it could be a roll-up, something that leaves a line on the screen, or a couple of lines, and then another line or a couple of lines appear. The other ones, when the person writing the subtitle assumes the time has been enough to read them, disappear, and so on and so forth. That would be the sort of roll-up, like in a galaxy far, far away, and the credits going up. And also pay attention to the synchronization. After that, we're going to see whether criticism is deserved or not. In this case, my assumption would be that the synchrony isn't really adequate, that the roll-up presentation is a little distracting, and that there is really superimposition of text and the image. Rather than clicking the link, which will load the video again, I will change screens for a moment, if you will allow, and it's already loaded right in here. And if the sound doesn't work, please do tell. This is from Back to the Future, the video game, 2010.
Jesus Christ! Jesus Christ, Doc, you disintegrated Einstein!
Calm down, Marty. I didn't disintegrate anything. The molecular structure of both Einstein and the car are completely intact.
Where the hell are they?
The appropriate question is, when the hell are they? You see, Einstein has just become the world's first time traveler. I sent him into the future. 1 minute into the future, to be exact, and at precisely one.
You see, the difference in technology with the comparison between 2010 as a video game and something that's produced today or yesterday in 2021, early 2021, would be that the mouth movements, the fluidity of the image would be different. So that could be perfected already. But that's a secondary matter. We have a lot of text on the screen, and the advancement of it isn't something that we are used to. So habit really is one of the things that we have to take into consideration at the time of judging whether the text is well presented or not. Also, this is a sort of strange justification of the text. And the tonality, the color, the positioning kind of interrupts what's happening. And game has been quite critical of what's happening in the center of the screen, would, as a consequence, have an immediate rejection of the text appearing. And rather than that, this being a graphic adventure with a lot of interaction by clicking, what you would concentrate on is the phrases that advance the adventure in some particular way. That's the first example from 2010 then. Going back to what we had at the beginning, which was the criticism, we have poor synchrony. That was my statement. I think that the synchrony isn't very good, although if we compare it, for example, with a live subtitle of public television, it's phenomenal because there's no gap. There's 1 second difference, perhaps. But what we saw as well is that there's an exact reproduction. There's a replica of what is said in the text itself, even though the speed might be too high. And it's been said already, so there's no SDH in any way. The second part, second case study, is an adventure game. This one is not a point and click. This one has rather a lot of text, but it's just advancing, it's consuming time, and it's interviewing people, something like that. The game was called Catherine, and it's an adventure game. The preliminaries for this one. Let's focus on the paralinguistic elements this time. Paralinguistic, including the aspects that without the sound we will realize were not there, correctly reflected. Also the cultural differences in localization, if there are any objects that are unknown, or if references are omitted to things that should perhaps have been emphasized in some case. And lastly, whether the closed captions that are given, or the burned-in text and the position of it, is idiosyncratic or regularized. Does it follow any norm? Does it follow any specific guideline? This will be also something that we can change slightly by thinking of the actions that are taking place in the surroundings of the text that is being read, that it's being acted, the shot changes, if that's in question or not, because it is in the case of film. It doesn't seem to be in the case of video game, because it's a much longer product as well. In a film, we can have, let's say, 3 hours, if it's The Birth of a Nation or something like that. But in a video game, 9 hours is very standard. 20 hours is becoming very standard as well. Or maybe infinite hours, because you can stay in that imaginary world forever. So let's judge that aspect, the one of the shot changes and the exchanges, how quick they are between the various speakers. Rather than clicking the link, I will go again to the video right here. This is Catherine, and I would like to challenge you to watching it, just a fragment, with no sound, and to realize what isn't included in the text that appears down below. There we go. No sound yet. All right. We have something that is supposed to be transcribed but isn't. The woman's talking, although the mouth is very tiny. We cannot really tell what she's saying. We get the main gist by accidental murder. Text on screen that will guide us through the adventure. It went quite quickly. Something's happening again here. There doesn't seem to be too much of a sound atmosphere. And the conversation begins. Who was talking out of these 3 people? We have no idea. We have absolutely no idea, but we assume that this is a fragment from somewhere in the middle of the game. It isn't really, it's quite at the beginning. So let's have a second look and see what we missed in these places. There's the siren there, the helicopters.
And in other news, we have more on the recent string of unexplained deaths that seem to be exclusively involving young men. Cause of death is unknown, and while police are investigating accidental causes, foul play has apparently not been.
Hey, change it! The match is on!
Oh, 2 beers over here.
Coming!
Catherine keeps telling me how her mother is constant.
Okay, we lost all of the ambience we were given by the bar, this interspace between action, between the control of being active and the basic cinematic scene of the film that we have. And then this Catherine keeps telling me, etc., although extremely long, is, well, clear on the screen in spite of the whitish colors. But we don't really know who's talking because the mouths are, again, extremely tiny. That might be another source of confusion. So this is adding up to the basic elements that we had decided already. It's not just a matter of text or what to include in the text, it's everything else. And in this case, all of the paralinguistic elements, the helicopter noise, the sirens, and so on, weren't immediately to be deduced from the situation, I would argue. Let's go for the third example. And this one gets us closer to the present. First of all, the criticism about this example, what we have just said, shot changes, they didn't really matter. Part of the text was missing. Utterance identification, so for example, whose voice is it, or who's talking, or whether it's on the phone or not, that didn't appear. It doesn't throughout the whole game, although it's quite accessible, being 2011. And lastly, the keeping in check of the line length, because we have lines of 80-something characters. They fit and they can be read, but your eyesight would go from one side to the other if you're not really following it just by ear. The differences that we saw between the sound on or sound off, the siren, the breaking news, the ambient noise, also the speaker identification, that was a big difference because we don't really know who's talking. We cannot really make decisions if it's an adventure game. Case study 3. This is based on a film. So when the film Deadpool was released, the video game was also released because they wanted to bank on it, obviously. This is a beat 'em up. This is a fighting game. But it's not the kind of fighting game that we see in Tekken, for example. It's not 2 characters bashing out on each other. It's more like a fight that happens on the way to things. There are several points in the game where you have conversations with people or cinematic introductions, and the rest of the time you walk to places. And while you walk, you use tools to make people's lives much more complicated, as we see. Then what are we going to analyze in this third case? We have SDH or don't we? Do we have any kind of mood indicator? Do we have any reference to accent? We have been talking about accents and how to identify them, and whether the identification is good enough for us to understand it. Because sometimes, and perhaps it's a common feeling, but I do feel it, sometimes at the beginning of films, they tell you, following the norm, or following the regulation that appears for that platform in particular, that that's Bach's Opus 736, or that it is calm music. I don't think that's very representative of what that really is. So unless I Shazam the song and they tell me, oh, it's Bach's most well-known work, that's quite a tiring exercise to be able to follow every single reference, cultural or not, because it's very similar to the credits at the end. If you have a look at the credits, you will see every single thing that's put into that production. But I don't think it guides you through it any better if it says, this is Bach's 736 opus. Well, how is it different from Bach's 737 if you're not an expert, perhaps? Let's see this Deadpool little fragment, and I have it loaded on the other side. This is Deadpool right here. This is a video game cinematic scene.
That wasn't Sinister. That was a clone.
Damn, Summers, what'd you have for breakfast? Smells like tacos.
You like tacos, Wade?
Oh, you know, I know this hot taco lady, Samantha. Oh, she makes the best.
Wade, what if you could never eat one of Samantha?
You see the line positioning? So it goes on forever and then it jumps line. It's approximately 85 to 86 characters when it goes to the next line. That's why the again is kind of like
and you simply move to the following line just for one word.
Yeah.
And you have the rest of the information on the upper subtitle. My God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does happen because the box is pre-established and they just cue the text by cutting chunks of the video. We can even see this in platforms sometimes when the job is extremely rushed. But this is not an extreme case, really, because there's a margin on the sides. The subtitle occupies, let's say, 2/3 of the screen horizontally, and then there's 1/3 divided into parts to the left and to the right. But is it too high? Is it readable enough? Does it change? Does it respect scene cuts? Does it change cameras correctly? It doesn't really. So we cannot assume that SDH is even a possibility, at least by 2013 that we are seeing. 2010 it didn't happen, 2011 it didn't, 2013, and this is a very big production. This video game cost about $56 million to make. They could have spent enough for an excellent subtitle, but maybe that wasn't a market requirement. That's what I mean. Maybe it wasn't expected. Maybe it was just an afterthought. And that's an acceptable business decision, I assume. This was the Deadpool example. So you see, we had accents, they weren't reflected. We had changes of scene, we had changes of character, we had even changes of screen. And very little to no lip movement, if that's a reference also for SDH and how to characterize it. Then finishing up, we have case study 3 criticism. The line divisions, it's not that they are wrong, it's that they are automatic and they don't respect any limits whatsoever. The decision here, I assume, would be, okay, we have 12 hours of programming, 12 hours of cinematic scenes. If we reduce the subtitle length to, let's say, maybe 37, 40, if we take it to the extreme, 42, if we want to be extremely generous, we will have twice the amount of subtitles, and we don't want to go there. Well, that's a decision, then it might be argued. But if it's automatic, or if it just so happened that the subtitle appeared like that, that's a different discussion. The length is excessive, definitely. Anything that goes over 50, I would say, shouldn't happen like that, because you can increase the size of the type font. This doesn't really match too well with video gaming. Most of the time, the font is quite tiny or extremely tiny, as we will see in the following example. So the readability is, in fact, quite low. It doesn't make it any easier to read it. Case study 4, you will probably be amazed at it, and you will be amazed that it's 2014. So we went one step backwards compared to the late 1980s text adventure games or text adventures, which were just a fixed image and conversations with yourself. This is a survival horror film, and it's also based on an alien film. It was at the time of Prometheus being released. So again, banking on something, very expensive video game to produce because you have a lot of rights to pay, but this is what happened in the preliminaries. We can study line length in this very short extract, the size and the color, because if the survival horror games are known for something, it's for being quite dark. So the colors are grayish to darkish to blackish. And if you write a white subtitle, a subtitle with a white type font, usually it should work. I don't think it does in Alien too much. And lastly, the questions of speed and synchrony. Is it too quick? Is it too slow? Both are wrong choices. Is it well synchronized, or does it happen as in the first example with Back to the Future? It's a little of an incongruity that it exists in that form. Let's have a look. It's just a couple of seconds once again, and it's loaded right here. Alien Isolation. This, in particular, is not a cinematic scene as such. It's the moment you land at the beginning of a stage, let's say. And this game looks like the Dooms or the Duke Nukems of historic fame. Let's see.
This is what's going to happen. There are emergency overflow circuits that feed excess power.
The number of characters here is 213.
My
and
God.
the stage is for 19 seconds. So the whole screen, the whole fragment here, and again, I'm not cherry picking, and I'm not being critical of what it is. I'm just trying to analyze why it happens and whether that tradition tells us anything about how things are going to evolve. But we have 211 characters divided in 2 lines, and if you can even see what it says in there, we have a full stop, if I decouple them, etc., etc. So it reaches the utmost possible end of text input, and then it goes to the next possible space. Just an automatized version of what it could be. This happens quite frequently in relatively expensive video games to make. So if something is very indie and contributions are done by social networks, for example, for the game to be made, you could have something extremely well done and that follows every single norm. In the middle of the market, something that doesn't cost more than $100 million to make and usually is called a AAA game, the middle, where all of the video games are, even the ones that are just for download, this tends to happen quite a lot, even in the 2020s that we are. Last 2 cases. We have observations about case study 4. The font is unreadable, even if you have a very high definition screen. In fact, having a high definition screen might even be deleterious for the subtitle font to be clearly watched. If you have anything over 1920 by 1564 in terms of the diagonal, you can't see anything at all. You can make it out if you are a meter away from the screen, but definitely not in a sort of living room environment. The amount of text, by all means, excessive. It's 211 characters. This might have been 6 separate subtitles or 6 separate subtitle boxes in several subtitle lines. And then the question of literal transcribing is revisiting us once again. What we've seen in the last 4 years, from 2010 to 2014, is the literal transcript being transformed into cut sections. And the cutting is automatized. Lords of Shadow 2. This is a Castlevania game. Castlevania is like Final Fantasy. It's a very, very, very long series and extremely expensive to make because it's hours and hours and hours of content, 20-something hours, in fact, in this case. So this is a AAA game. It's also from 2014. Another one is going to be released. The same methodology is going to be used. That's why whether the example comes from 2014 or 2025, the difference is going to be in image definition or in playability or in the games console that you use for it to perform. But there's no normalization yet, and there doesn't seem to be any intention of introducing it. Castlevania Lords of Shadow is perhaps the best example of that paper that I will very gladly share with you at the end of the presentation. But let's have a look at these fragments and let's consider what we could have done with different accents once again.
Have you brought me another piece?
There are still some missing pieces.
There is one other piece, and I know who has it.
Okay, the line divisions would be fine. The length, also fine. Type font, sometimes not very readable against sort of these dark spaces. And the size of the type font, that's debatable. If it was much larger, it would take up too much of the screen. That's what the video game aesthetes would say. But there's the case of the Scottish accent here. It's quite surprising that someone from Romania, from, I don't know, the year 1300, speaks with a very modern Scottish accent. But let's not ask those kinds of questions, because everybody speaks English in films, even if they are from, I don't know, an unknown planet, as someone was suggesting before. Then here we have some sort of idea of what to do, but we also have dubbing actors who work in film, and a film producer putting money in for this to go ahead. Then AAA productions and things that cost over $100 million, these days maybe $200 million, are much more refined and sophisticated, and they follow more or less what you can see in platforms, in the Netflixes and the Disney Pluses and the Apple Pluses of the world. The last one is a very big production, and I would like to compare, again, with the example that we saw from Catherine at the beginning. Remember that Catherine was a graphic adventure. We can also see the genre differences within video gaming. About the Castlevania, we have the line divisions that are automatized, but with fewer characters in the top line. So we have a limit of 37, 42, depending on the part of the game and who produced the subtitle for that part. But then we have the automatization of live in one word in the second line, rather than making it into a sort of pyramid shape subtitle. Then there's the end result question of accents that we saw. Scottish for a Romanian, and how to represent it there. And after all, this is not SDH or anything close to it, because there's no reference to the music, there's no reference to the character, we don't really see who's talking in very highly populated areas of the game, so that's something to be resolved. And the last one is Halo 5. Halo, again, is a long series. It starts in the 90s, early 90s. There's a couple of games, Halo 6, and another one that's a first-person shooter as well. This one is a sort of virtual reality game where you play the role of a soldier. And once again, I challenge you to make the distinction between the no sound versus the yes sound version of it, and what was missing from a subtitle that's a little more perfected, although not SDH yet. That's the final one, and then we'll have the summarization of what I said. First, without the sound. A clip from the beginning, the cinematic scenes that open the game. Okay, we have yellow color, speaker identification, lock and Tanaka after that, lock again, buck, no reference to the noises that are happening right there. We would probably have some, there it is, remote control vibration perhaps, when this is happening. Let's go back to the beginning and see whether the sound makes any difference. It should.
Comm check.
Comms working fine, Locke.
Copy that, Tanaka. Spartan Buck online and ready.
Spartan Vale online.
Weapons free. Contact.
All right, there are many things to describe here. We could say what the soundtrack is, the sound effects, whether the sound effects are connected to the viewer, user, gamer through haptics of some kind. The most obvious one would be the movement of the remote, which is now pre-programmed in the games themselves. Any criticism about this part? Well, something advantageous that happened in 2015 with a new generation of consoles is that you didn't have to worry too much about the number of megabytes or gigabytes or terabytes that it would occupy, because you can upload it, update it, and patch it after you release it. But some sort of compensation would be necessary for it not to be so quick. And the subtitle layout throughout the game, not in this fragment because it's the very beginning and there's very little text, is rather confusing because we went back to what we saw in Back to the Future. So 2015-16 with Halo here and Back to the Future have a lot in common. because we went back to the roll-ups instead of the pop-ins, and the speaker identification through color isn't that clear anymore. So there are missing SDH nuances all through the game. And again, we are not cherry-picking or going for the error. This is a commonality throughout. All of these case studies gave us some idea of what could be done for SDH. How could we cope? We could enrich the text, or we could add references to the sound landscape, if we are allowed, because sometimes technical difficulties, aesthetic decisions do intervene, the same as in films. Perhaps more, because the number of rights for video gaming sometimes are connected to the number of rights for films themselves. Control of vibration, I have emphasized it because it's something that's actually happening already. And if we are to talk of subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing in these contexts, the context of recreational products that you can act upon, it could also be an interactive Netflix episode of a particular series, because we have some say in how things are going to be. But that redefinition goes through the technical separation and also the genre separation. There are games with a lot of text that would be impossible to be made into 15 characters per second, same as in television series these days, 21 characters per second. How many? And who do we try it out with? Because there's one thing to get, for example, a sample of people who are deaf that watch television, but if we get to more niche environments, like the person who uses this kind of genre of video game, it would go practically nuts. Some guidelines that I suggested at the time and have a lot in common with the norm and what we see around these parts. First of all, we have the general level of what the subtitle should be. Is it a subtitle? Is it a transcript? Is it traditional or is it SDH? And also about the normativity. Is it idiosyncratic or is it conventional? In the relationship between sound and text part, we have dialogue, music, soundtrack, all of those things could be described. All of those things could be referenced. The same goes for the tagging or speaker identification, particularly important in our case, because we are talking about deaf and hard of hearing. Same goes for the text on screen, the in-game instructions, the tutorials, the onomatopoeia, for example, common in Tekken-type fighting games, one-on-one rather than first person, and mood indicators that would have been extremely appropriate in the case of Deadpool, for example. About the purely textual level, how the orthography works, how we present it to the viewer, I have emphasized three parts: the sequencing, which connects to the speed, and then emphasis and the use of italics. Sometimes the use of italics is completely idiosyncratic because it's a creative suggestion, and some other times it is quite appropriate. It's very much film-like and maybe author film-like, exquisite in terms of following a certain norm. My final questions, and this would be for the opening of the debate, is where do you think the inconsistencies really lie and why do they happen? And the second part would be, how do we create a norm that doesn't restrict the originality that could be used for these sorts of recreational entertainment? For more info, I will happily share that paper from 2020 that's now in a book, quite inaccessible, but thankfully I have a proof. And if you want to have a Telegram chat with me, I'll leave the QR code in there. And if you want a more detailed and with more fragments of this corpus of video game analyses, I made a video presentation that goes step by step if you ever find it useful. And it's in the second QR code down there. And I have spoken slightly slower at the end because probably you are scanning the codes. And now that you have scanned them, I will finish the presentation and let Juanpe take over.
COST, European Cooperation in Science and Technology. This video is based upon work from Cost Action Lead Me CA 19142, supported by COST. COST is a funding agency for research and innovation networks. Our actions help connect research initiatives across Europe and enable scientists to grow their ideas by sharing them with their peers. This boosts their research, career and innovation. www.cost.eu. This work is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution CC BY funded by the Horizon 2020 Framework Programme of the European Union.